video recorded every aspect of our visit. He had a basement filled with all sorts of film equipment and movie props, focusing on elements of death and destruction. But the most memorable part of the visit was having to climb over this man's enormous boa constrictor who was napping in the doorway of the house. We were told that it had just eaten some sort of rodent, so it wasn't interested in us. At least that's what we were told. And we survived. I'll never forget having to step over that thing. Anyway, my experience with snakes can't compare with the experience that the Israelites had who were being bitten by snakes left and right. Now, mind you, some people would say they deserved those snake bites. After all, the Israelites had been moaning and groaning their way through the wilderness for a long, long time. First, it was the food. It was nothing at all like the great and wonderful food they had in Egypt. There, the fish were terrific, not to mention all the great melons, mangoes, and figs. People comforted themselves as they reminisced about all the good things in Egypt as they trudged along, eating nothing but manna every day. And trudging along was thirsty work. So much so that folks ran out of water. Now you might remember that after the complainers groaned to Moses, he somehow managed, with God's help, to produce water from a rock. But that really wasn't good enough, because back in Egypt, they had juice, wine, and enough water all day. Isn't it strange how when life gets tough, we remember the good old days with longing and nostalgia? Even though life wasn't really better back then, we all have a tendency to remember when life was simpler, easier, less stressful, and just plain happier. And that's how the Israelites saw things. But what they forgot was that back in Egypt, they lived in slavery. Did they really want to go back to those days? Asked Moses. And you know what the people said? Yes! All this wandering around for years had blurred their vision, and some of the younger ones didn't even remember Egypt. Anyway, that's what was happening when today's Old Testament story begins. The Israelites were out there in the wilderness, trekking all over the place, eating the same old manna day in and day out, drinking water from a rock and getting dusty and dirty and worn out. Grumble, grumble, grumble. That's all they could do. They had forgotten all about God and God's promises to them. They had the new laws that Moses received from God. You know, those 10 rules that we talked about last week. Anyway, the new laws guiding them didn't matter one bit. All that mattered to them was the fact that life was tough and they just didn't want to put up with it anymore. And it was all God's fault anyway. Grumble, 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 complain, complain, complain. And then, one morning, just as everybody began climbing out of their tents for breakfast, it happened. Snakes started creeping and crawling all over the place. Not just harmless little garter snakes. No, sir, these were the kind of snakes that love to bite people. And bite they did. Those fiery creatures bit and bit and bit, and their bites were deadly and dangerous. People started dying from the nasty snake bites. It became downright dangerous for people to even go out for a leisurely stroll after dinner. Finally, one day, everyone got together and decided to tiptoe through the snakes in search of Moses, hoping he would come to their rescue one more time. This time, they didn't complain. As a matter of fact, people were full of sadness and remorse. Moses get it now. We forgot all about God. We've been terrible people. We have messed up. We admit it. So what do you think? Can you get God to help us out one more time? This time we promise to do better. Really. We mean it this time. Just get these snakes out of here, please. Do you know what? Moses had a little heart-to-heart with God, and sure enough, God invited those slithering serpents to crawl off into the dark reaches of the wilderness. Go on, get yourselves back under those rocks. Go into the caves and shadows where you belong, God said to the snakes. Now, there was something else that God did the day the snakes disappeared. God told Moses to make a snake out of bronze and to stick it up on top of a tall pole so everyone could see it. And then God said, now have everyone stop looking down at the ground. No need to watch for snakes anymore. They're gone. Indeed, tell everyone to look up, and see this brass snake on a stick, and remember. Remember what God did for you, how God kept the promise to keep the people safely, to bring the people safely out of Egypt. No more slaves, but free to walk in the light of God. Maybe being brought so close to death helped the Israelites remember how much the gift of life really means. Snakes that had been a means to death suddenly became a way to life. And for years and years after the snake bites, people saw the snake on top of that pole and remembered how much God loved them in spite of their moaning and groaning, complaining, and sinful ways. God's love cured the snake bites in the wilderness, and that's the story Jesus talked about one night with a man named Nicodemus. There in the dark of night, Jesus told the story about the snakes and the pole, and how God lifted up the serpent so God's people would be able to get out of the darkness of sin and venture into the light of God's redeeming love. Nicodemus was a man who knew the stories of the Torah, and he must have known about the story of good snakes and bad snakes. But he probably wasn't quite sure what to make of Jesus and his talk about a snake on a stick. But we know, or at least we should know, Jesus was talking about himself. He is that snake on a stick. He was lifted up on a cross one day so all us sinners could come out of the darkness and into the light. Jesus is the good snake given for all of us, no matter who we are or where we've been. God's gift of life and love has come to us and is walking with us every day. It's just that oftentimes we're too busy moaning and groaning and complaining to realize that we have been given the cure for the snakes that keep biting us every day. The trouble is we don't recognize the cure for what it is. Jesus came to us as God's gift of love, but also God gave us Jesus as a means to change all those things we need to change about ourselves. It's just that we don't much like the image of snake Jesus. We'd much rather have a nice, calm, loving, good shepherd Jesus that really suits us a whole lot better. It's just so much more pleasing to see Jesus counting sheep and tending to a peaceful flock. Jesus nipping at our heels, biting us as we walk, just doesn't fit. But what Jesus told Nicodemus that night and what Jesus is trying to tell us is that we need the snake-biting Jesus just as much as we need the shepherd Jesus. And it was the snake biting Jesus that wound up on the cross. Remember our story last week, Jesus turning everything upside down so we can get right side up? That was the kind of stuff that got Jesus into so much trouble. Throughout his ministry, Jesus spoke up and spoke out, not to comfort the comfortable, but to disturb and bite those who insisted that God's love was meant only for people who were on the inside and wanted to continue just as they were. And the truth is that all too often we don't want to get ourselves turned upside down. We don't recognize that Jesus is biting at us, urging us to get moving forward, nudging us out from under the darkness and into the light of God's grace right here, right now. Remember that on Good Friday, it was not only the crowd that called for the death of Jesus, but also his closest followers, his disciples, who conspired in his death and abandoned him to the forces of evil. After all, it was Simon Peter who denied Jesus before the rooster crowed. Fred Craddock, preacher and teacher, tells this story about himself. He writes, "I was in graduate school at Vanderbilt. I had left my wife and children in the small parish I served and moved into a little room to prepare for those terrible comprehensive exams. It's a make it or break it time. They can kill you. I would go every night around 11:30 or midnight to a little all-night diner, no tables, just stools at the counter, and have a grilled cheese sandwich and a cup of coffee to take a break from my studies. It was the same every night. The fellow behind the counter at the grill knew when I walked in to prepare a grilled cheese and a cup of coffee. He'd give me refill after refill. I joined the men of the night sitting there hovering over coffee, still thinking about my own possible questions about the New Testament oral exam. Then I noticed a man who was there when I went in, but had not been waited on. I had been waited on and had refill after refill, so had the others. And finally, the man behind the counter went to the man at the end of the counter and said, "What do you want?" He was an old, gray-haired black man. Whatever the man said, the fellow went to the grill, scooped up a little dark patty from the back of the grill, and put it on a piece of bread without anything else, without a plate or a napkin. The cook handed it to the man who gave him some money, and then went out the side door by the garbage can and out onto the street. He sat on the curb with the 18-wheelers of the night, along with the salt and pepper from the street, to season his sandwich. Craddock continues, "I didn't say anything. I did not reprimand, protest, or witness to the cook. I did not go out and sit beside the man on the curb, on the edge. I didn't do anything. I was thinking about the questions coming up on the New Testament. And I left that little place, went up the hill back to my room to resume my studies, and off in the distance, I heard a rooster crow." Jesus is the one who has come to cure our snake bites, but too often we just don't want to be cured. As we travel through the next weeks of Lent that lead us to the cross, I pray that all of us will be able to come out of the darkness that limits our vision and into the light that invites us to look up and see the good snake that has been lifted up for us. And I pray that one day all of us who say we follow Christ will recognize him as he walks among us. Christ is God's love given freely to us as a gift of life. Thank God for the cure for snake It's good to see some of our folks who have been gone for a while have returned. And I'm really proud of all of you because obviously you remembered to spring forward. Congratulations. Along with joys, we often have concerns. Are there concerns to be lifted up this morning?
Prayers for Kim Stover, who's having surgery this coming week.
Oh, that's right. Thank you for reminding us. Kim Stover will be having surgery this week, so let's keep her in our thoughts and prayers. Are there any others? I invite you as we enter into our time of prayer to listen and reflect on this meditation, Healing in the Wilderness. Sometimes, God, it seems no matter where